Your lecturer is Dr. J. Rufus Fears. A master storyteller and celebrated professor, Dr. Fears is the David Ross Boyd Professor of Classics at the University of Oklahoma, where he holds the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty. During his career, Professor Fears has won 25 teaching awards, including the Medal for Excellence in College and University Teaching from the Oklahoma Foundation for Excellence.
These lectures are titled Famous Greeks, Part 1.
I want to welcome you to our course, Famous Greeks. This is an innovative and original approach to Greek history for our own day. It is one that examines the achievements of classical Greece through the lives of the great individuals, the artists, the poets, the warriors, and the statesmen who made that history. From the days of the Trojan War, when Agamemnon and Achilles and Hector fought for honor and life and glory upon the plains of Troy, down through the time of Cleopatra and the last resistance of the Greek world to the power of Rome. We will draw upon the most current scholarship, historical, literary, and archaeological, to place these figures, these lives, into their historical context. Our lives will thus illuminate the most important intellectual and artistic currents of one of the most creative periods in human history. Now, for the Greeks, politics was the very center of historical existence. Aristotle said that man is by nature a political animal. And our lives will be focused upon the political history of Greece, but the artistic and intellectual achievements will be placed within that political context, working together to form a broad fabric of the historical achievements of the Greeks. We will focus upon the great eras of Greek history, the Trojan War, which the Greeks regarded as real history and which provided the material for some of the greatest tragedies, as well as for the Odyssey and the Iliad. We will then look at the emergence of historical Greece in the figure of two great lawgivers, Lycurgus of Sparta and Solon of Athens. Those two cities which would be the polar opposites and yet work together to lead Greece to victory in the great challenge of the Persian invasions. And that struggle for freedom that was the war against the Persians will be the next focus of our lectures. We will fight with the Spartans at Thermopylae under Leonidas. We will see Pausanias lead the Spartans to victory at Plataea. We will be with Themistocles in the Battle of Salamis. And we will also look at two non-Greeks, Xerxes of Persia and Croesus of Lydia, who for the historian Herodotus, the father of history, provided enduring examples of the abuse of power and the lessons of history. The centerpiece of our course is the golden age of Athenian democracy. Its artistic figures like Phidias, its literary figures like Sophocles, its philosophers like Socrates and Anaxagoras, and focusing upon Pericles, that statesman who is worthy to rank with Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln as one of the three greatest leaders in democratic history. And then we shall see how the Athenians, with their wisdom, their creativity, could nonetheless not avoid plunging themselves into a great self-destructive war with Sparta. We will look at figures like Nicias and Alcibiades. We will suffer with the Athenians in the siege of Syracuse. And then we shall see how Athens, defeated in war, would put on trial and execute its noblest figure, Socrates, of all the men of his day, the best, the wisest, and the most just, and thus condemn itself in the eyes of posterity. We will look at his students, Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon, and see how they judged the democracy of Athens, and see how, in the 4th century, the Greeks, particularly the Athenians, lost their faith in the ability of democratic institutions to solve their political and economic problems. We shall see the emergence of Philip of Macedonia and Alexander the Great, perhaps the most innovative statesman in all of history. And we will conclude by seeing the rise of Rome, looking at King Pyrrhus of Epirus, who fought with such courage against the Romans, and then turn and look finally at Cleopatra, the last of a dynasty, and a woman whose vision would endure right on down through the age of Byzantium. So it is with a noble history and noble figures that we are engaged in this course. It is a course which the founders of our country would have told you was one of the most useful single intellectual disciplines you could engage in as the citizen of a free republic. You see, the founders believed that history was the most useful single discipline. Not that commerce wasn't important to study, or law, or medicine, but each of that attracted a pool of individuals. History was something every citizen should study, because in the lessons of the past, we saw writ the future. We could learn from the past as from a laboratory. We could learn about how democracy had been born, how it had flourished, why it ultimately failed. And of all the lessons of the past, the founders believed that Greek and Roman history were most useful to the citizens of a new republic in a new world. For there one could see the experiment with democracy in Athens. We could see the balanced constitution of Rome, which served as a model for our own constitution, and learn from them. And the founders also believed that biography was the most engaging means of approaching history. John Adams, one of our founders, said that virtue was to liberty as the soul is to the body. In other words, it was virtue that animated liberty. Well, I'd like to adapt that a little bit and say that biography is the true soul of history. That through the lives of worthy individuals, examples both of good and of evil, we can most learn from history. Biographein, to write a life. The very word is Greek, and the beginning of history deals with biographies. Herodotus, when he chose to write about the Persian Wars, did not begin with social and economic history. He began with the life of King Croesus of Lydia, focusing upon the biography of that most rich and powerful man of his day. So too in the Bible, 2 Samuel is brilliant in its illumination of the character of King David. But it would not be until an age very much like our own, the age of the Roman Empire, the 1st and 2nd century A.D., that the most able biographer of antiquity, perhaps the most able biographer of all time, Plutarch, would flourish. The age, as I said, was much like our own. The Roman Empire united much of the world under one law. The languages of Greek and Latin would carry you from the frontiers of Scotland all the way out to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers of today, to Iraq, from the north shores of Germany to the sands of the Sahara. It was an age in which the individual citizen reached a stage of affluence unparalleled until the 20th century. It was an age of cultural unity, but of broad, diverse tolerance, in which a number of local cultures flourished as well. And one of the most representative figures of this age of the immense majesty of the Roman Empire was Plutarch of Chaeronea. Born around 46 A.D., he would live on till sometime after 127 A.D. And he is the classical model for our course, for he chose to write a series of matched biographies, pairing a famous Greek with a famous Roman, his lives of the famous Greeks and Romans. He was well educated. He was a Greek by birth, but he was a Roman citizen, and his family had been Roman citizens for a number of generations. He lived in the small town of Chaeronea, was deeply involved with his local town life, and he served as a priest of the god Apollo at the great oracle of Delphi. He had studied philosophy as well as literature. He spent time in Rome and was well thought of by the Emperor Hadrian. And, in fact, he spent years pondering why Rome had grown to such greatness and how Rome was the bearer of the civilization of Greece. The Emperor Hadrian himself wrote fluent Greek, wrote poetry in the language, was deeply indebted to Greek architecture for his own architectural formulations, and Plutarch may well have received a mandate from the Emperor Hadrian to write these lives of famous Greeks and Romans, to show how that the achievements of Greece were carried on through the glories of Rome. He also was a philosopher, Plutarch, and he wrote a series of moral essays. And whether writing specifically on philosophy or writing biographies, his purpose was moral instruction, how to make his reader better through the study of these lives. And thus he says, I will frequently give less attention to a famous battle or famous siege of a city than to a single anecdote that illustrates the character of the individual I am describing. His biographies were enormously influential. Read again and again in the Byzantine period, they were rediscovered in Europe in the Renaissance. Translated from the Greek into French, they would pass on into English and be used by Shakespeare for some of his greatest plays like Antony and Cleopatra or Julius Caesar. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a great admirer of Plutarch and his lives, as was Rousseau. But perhaps most interestingly, Harry Truman, that most practical of American presidents, said that whenever he had a difficult political problem, he would sit down with old Plutarch, and he found more wisdom in Plutarch than in all of his advisors together. And I want us to begin that journey, as Plutarch did, with the life of Theseus, a figure of what we would call the legendary past of Athens, but who to the Athenians was as real as George Washington. He was the founder of their nation. And in later generations, Theseus, once king of Athens, stood forth as the standard by which all other rulers, all political decisions were to be matched. Theseus would have lived, as we date these matters, around 1300 BC. As Plutarch says, he lived so far back in the past that legend began to merge with history. And Plutarch shows us himself at his best by carefully matching one source with another, by seeing what legends seem to be plausible, and giving us a biography that makes Theseus a living, breathing, animated founder of his nation. Theseus, the story went, was born in the small town of Troezen. He was nominally the grandson of the king of Troezen, but his birth had come about in a strange fashion. For a stranger had come through Troezen. Aegeus was his name. He was king of Athens, not known well there in Troezen, and he was coming to Troezen after he had passed through the oracle at Delphi. And again in our story, Delphi, Apollo, his great priestess there, looking into the future, giving wisdom, will be a leitmotif, joining together the themes of Greek history. For it was revered by the Greeks right on down into the Roman period as the most authentic statement of divine will. And Aegeus had passed through Delphi and been told not to have a child until he was back in Athens. But Delphi frequently put its wisdom in rather curious, difficult to understand terms, and it said, "Loose not the wineskin until in Athens you are again." And not quite sure what this was, he was persuaded by the king of Troezen to sleep with his daughter. And out of this union a child was conceived, and then Aegeus, before he went back to Athens, told the girl, "Look, if this is a boy child, I want you to do the following. Here are a pair of sandals, here is a sword, put them under this rock. And when he grows up, if he's strong enough to raise up the rock, give him these sandals and sword and send him to me. Off he went. Sure enough, it was a boy child, raised up as her son and raised up unto the grandfather. And then when he turned 16, his mother said, come with me to this rock. Lifted it up, the boy did, and she said, you're worthy. Take the sandals, take the sword, go to Athens. But Theseus, true to the heroic character, would not go by sea. That was the easy way to go. So instead, he took a land route, and all along the way met with ferocious monsters. Each monster trying to intimidate and terrify the citizens of his day, and Theseus won a reputation as a savior by ridding Greece of these monsters. Men like Periphates, the club man, who carried this enormous club and bashed everybody in the head, and Theseus took it away from him and bashed him, and the club became his symbol, and in art he is always portrayed holding this club. Arsenis, we might call him Pine Tree Man, because he would take travelers and bend them down with these two pine trees. So the pine trees would be bent to the ground and then spring them loose and split the person in two. And Theseus decided to punish him and others in the same fashion. So he bent Sinis down and split him in two. And then went on to we might call her the pig of Chromion. Some said that was a wild boar. Others said it was a woman, so lustful and ugly and vicious that she robbed and seduced every traveler who came by. Either way, Theseus rid the world of her. He went on to Sciron, who would make people bend down to wash his feet and then kick them into the sea. And finally on to Procrustes, who took individuals and stretched them out to fit a bed he had. And if they were not long enough, he stretched them until they were. And if they were too long, he would chop them off. So once again, Theseus put him to an end in that fashion. And so having carried out all these brave acts, in which, for the Athenians in their legends, he becomes the Attic counterpart of Hercules, who was the hero of the Spartans and rid the world of terrible monsters. So our Theseus comes to Athens, and there is recognized by his father. The legend of Theseus attracted myths from other famous individuals of the past, like Medea. And in our legend of Theseus, she is actually married to Aegeus, the king of Athens and the father of Theseus. And she recognizes Theseus and the danger he presents to her children, and she urges the old man, who has not yet recognized his son, to poison the stranger. But as the banquet is going on, Theseus pulls out his sword to cut the meat, and his father recognizes him. And so Theseus becomes the prince of Athens and immediately establishes his courage. For not long after he has been recognized by his father, there comes to Athens the dreaded ships from Crete, from King Minos, the king of Crete. Every 9 years, the Athenians must pay the dreaded tribute to King Minos of Crete. 7 virgins and 7 young men must be taken back to Crete, put down into the winding maze of the labyrinth, and devoured by the Minotaur, half bull and half man. And Theseus courageously volunteers for this assignment, and he is sent off. And there he is exhibited with the other youths and maidens from Athens in the great courtyard of the palace at Knossos. The Minotaur, the result of the lust of the wife of Minos, Pasiphae, for a magnificent bull. The bull sires through her a child, half man and half bull. And ashamed of this stepson, we might call him, King Minos sticks him away in this huge maze, the labyrinth. And so, as he is exhibited there in the courtyard, Theseus is observed by the king's daughter, Ariadne. And she is struck with him, communicates with him, gives him a ball of thread and says, hold on to this ball of thread as you wind through the labyrinth. Theseus does so. He encounters the Minotaur. Having no weapon but his hands, beats this monster to death. and then finds his way back out and flees with the beautiful Ariadne, saving the young men and the virgins. He gets distracted on the way back. She is seasick. He goes off to fix the ship. She is left there on the island and apparently forgotten by him. But nonetheless, he sails back to Athens. But whenever this ship went out, it always sailed with a black sail because it was a death ship. And now it comes sailing back into port. Theseus so distracted that he fails to raise a white sail. And his father sees it, thinks that his son is dead, hurls himself into the sea, which will ever after be known as the Aegean Sea. And Theseus arrives, filled with victory, only to learn of his father's death. But he becomes now king of Athens and carries out the first great constitutional revolution at Athens. For he abolishes the kingship and establishes Athens as a democracy, with himself as nothing more than commander-in-chief, and establishes the rule that every Athenian will be equal to one another. And then he joins together the various towns of Attica into one great strong city, Athens. And so in these terms, the Athenians viewed Theseus as the founder of their democracy and the founder of a unified Athens. He is also, for the Athenians, and they put great weight upon this, the founder of their tradition in foreign policy of always going to the aid of those who are weak. It was this very policy that would one day lead Athens, centuries later, into the great war with Sparta. An ideal that if you have power and do not use it in pursuit of the good, then you are in fact immoral. And so we find Theseus in the legends of Athens bringing aid and comfort to Hercules. We find Theseus alone being willing to welcome Oedipus, blind and disgraced, a pariah, into Athens and giving him his final shelter. And Theseus is, for the Athenians, the example of the humane, beneficial use of power. But he is also, for the Athenians, the example of the ingratitude of democracy. For more than once in their history, the Athenians would turn out leaders who had served them well, and so in this distant past as well, the Athenians had grown restive under the power of Theseus, driven him out, sent him into exile, where he would die through treachery. He was living on the island of Skyros, and King Lycomedes, perhaps trying to gain favor with the Athenians, took him up on a high place and pushed him into the waters. And so Theseus died, an outcast. But the Athenians believed deeply, that at that most critical moment in their history, when the armies of King Darius came to conquer them, the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, at the supreme moment, Theseus reappeared on the field of battle, a great apparition leading them to victory. And so they followed the oracle of Delphi, went back to the island of Skyros, and in 486 solemnly brought back what they believed to be the bones of Theseus, discovering a grave with a coffin of a mighty man in it, a mighty warrior with a bronze-headed spear. Brought it back to Athens, interred it, and ever thereafter worshipped Theseus with divine honors as the hero of Athens. Now, we might ask ourselves the question, is there any history to this? Or are these just legends that the Athenians made up to satisfy their vanity? Well, it's very interesting. In the first place, no figure has so many places named after him in the land of Athens as does Theseus. Time and time again, a spot, a rock, a shrine was identified with events from the history of Theseus. But more than that, archaeology has uncovered for us remarkable evidence that the times, at least, of Theseus were true. About 1300 BC, the very time that we place Theseus, there was in Crete a mighty civilization, centered around the place called Knossos. It was the archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans who, at the turn of the century, around 1900, began his excavations there, uncovering a mighty palace with a great courtyard in it, showing us that Crete was the center of a literate civilization, showing us that Knossos was the center of the island of Crete. And there's no more evocative sight in all of the ancient world than this paved road running from Knossos out over the mountains to other palaces of Crete. Crete of 100 cities, as it was called. More than that, the Greeks themselves, the historian Thucydides, believed that Minos had been the first ever to rule over a thalassocracy, a sea empire, and that his naval vessels dominated the Mediterranean Sea. And sure enough, pottery from Crete, from this age of Knossos, is found as far away as Sicily and Egypt and Syria. But we also have the legend of the Minotaur, do we not? And there, in Crete, the cult of the bull was at the very center of religion. And the palace of Knossos is decorated with great bull horns. And there's a courtyard, exactly like the courtyard described in our legend of Theseus, where young men were engaged in the activity of leaping over the horns of wild bulls. And yes, the very word labyrinth, labyrinthos, means the place of the double axe. And all over the walls of the palace at Knossos, we find the sign of a double axe. And so there is this historical kernel to the legend of Theseus, this figure who attracted to himself legends from the far reaches of Greek mythology. For the Athenians, Theseus sailed with the Argonauts in search of the golden fleece. Theseus became the friend of Hercules. And they told of the best friend that Theseus had, Theseus, and how the two of them went down into Hades together in search of everlasting life. And they sat on the very throne of Hades, and Theseus was quick enough to get up and leave, while Theseus stayed there and was turned to stone. So Theseus, like Hercules, could go down into the very bowels of hell and come back. Now, we ask ourselves about legends of this kind, the role they play in forming the character of a people. Theseus, for the Athenians, embodied the ideals of democracy, the ideals of equality of all citizens. He embodied the ideal of giving help to those who stood in need of it. He had his other side. He was a lustful figure. At the age of 50, he was struck by the beauty of Helen of Sparta and sought to marry her, carried her away, and kept her under armed guard until she would be old enough for him. His seduction and rape of Helen brought upon the Athenians the wrath of her brothers, Castor and Pollux, and they came upon Athens. So the Athenians also made him human, as well as a figure of mighty strength. Do we have figures like that in our own history? We once did. George Washington. For generations of schoolboys and girls, Washington stood as the embodiment of all that was best in Americans. He was a man of honor, integrity. We told the story of the schoolboy who cut down the cherry tree, and when asked by his father, did he do it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie." Well, more recent generations of historians have debunked this. What significance is it, they say? It never could have happened. Yet the very legend itself speaks to the values of a nation. And a nation that valued honesty and integrity in its leaders, a nation that valued a story like this, could never have allowed itself to be looked in the eye and lied to. And so the Athenian would have told you, yes, there is a historical kernel to Theseus. Yes, there was a labyrinth. Yes, it is probable that a great naval fleet from Crete demanded tribute from us. Yes, it is probable that our nation was brought together and given its basic values by one single figure named Theseus. But far more to us, it is important that we have heroes, heroes we can admire, heroes who will guide our children into the values of democracy. Theseus lived a brief time before the great war with Troy. He was a generation before the Trojan War. And it was this event, this epoch-making event as far as the Greeks were concerned, which would give to the entire Greek world and to all of its legacy that proud story and its proud heroes of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Hector. And to these we will turn in our next lecture.